The year was 1886, and the wind across the Colorado High Plains was not so much a weather pattern as it was a geological force. It was a constant, scouring presence that carved patience into the faces of the living and scoured the paint from the boards of the dead. For Elara Vance, in the first summer of her widowhood, the wind was the voice of everything she had to face alone. It was in the ceaseless whisper through the buffalo grass, the mournful howl around the corners of the cabin Matthias had built, and the grit it pushed through the smallest cracks in the window frames to settle on every surface of her quiet life. It was against this perpetual assault that she waged her strange and solitary war, not with hammer and nail, but with a spade and a line of string. Most folk, when faced with the inevitable tyranny of a plains winter, looked to their structures. They chinked logs with fresh mud and straw, they banked sod against their foundations, and they prayed their roofs would bear the load of the coming snow. Elara Vance did these things, for she was a practical woman, but her true efforts were directed outward, in the sun-hardened soil 50 feet to the north and west of her home. There, she was planting trees. Not a decorative row of cottonwoods to offer shade, but a dense, deliberate, and to the eyes of her neighbors, utterly mad arrangement of spruce and pine saplings. They were little more than twigs, sourced with immense effort from the sheltered ravines miles away, and she planted them in 3 staggered rows, forming a deep, crescent-shaped shield that seemed to offer no shield at all. Hiram Poole was the first to stop, reining in his horse and watching her for a long moment from the track that passed for a road. He was a man whose opinions were as solid and weathered as the fence posts he drove into the ground. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and approached with the slow gait of a man preparing to deliver a difficult but necessary truth. His sister, Dorothea Weiss, remained in the wagon, her face a mask of pinched concern. "Elara," Hiram began, his voice kind but firm, foregoing any preamble. "What is the purpose of this?" He gestured with a calloused hand at the collection of fragile saplings, each one supported by a small pile of stones at its base. Elara straightened up from her work, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a dirt-caked forearm. The sun was high and relentless. "It's a windbreak, Hiram." Her answer was simple, offered as a plain fact. Hiram's gaze swept from the tiny trees to the vast, empty horizon, and a look of deep pity settled in his eyes. He had known Matthias, had respected his skill with an axe, but he had always thought him a man with strange, old country notions. It seemed his widow had inherited them. "A windbreak is made of seasoned planks, 6 inches thick, braced with timbers. Or it's a wall of sod. This," he said, nudging one of the saplings gently with the toe of his boot, "is a switch. The first winter gale will snap these like toothpicks. The snow will bury them, and then it will bury your cabin." From the wagon, Dorothea called out, her voice carrying on the very wind Elara sought to fight. "Elara, dear, your grief is understandable, but you are wasting your strength on fancies. Let Hiram and the other men help you bank the house properly. That is the sensible way." Their words were not meant to be cruel. They were the rigid, logical expressions of a community that survived by adhering to proven methods. Their wisdom was a collection of past successes, a liturgy of what worked. Watching an outcome was not the same as understanding the principle, and their experience told them that small, living things were no match for the dead, overwhelming power of a blizzard. They saw a grieving woman engaged in a futile, heartbreaking ritual, and they chose amusement, cloaked in pity, as the safer position. Elara offered them a thin, tired smile. She had expected this. She had heard the whispers when she traded 2 of her laying hens for a sturdy wheelbarrow at the general store. And she saw the looks exchanged when she was seen hauling buckets of water from the creek day after day to tend her fledgling grove. I appreciate your concern, Hiram, truly. But this is Matthias's way. Invoking her dead husband's name was both a shield and an explanation, though it was one they clearly did not accept. It placed her actions in the realm of sentiment, not science, making her project an act of mourning, which was easier for them to dismiss. Hiram shook his head slowly, a man witnessing a tragedy he was powerless to prevent. As you wish, Elara, but our offer to help stands, when the time comes. He turned and walked back to his horse, the matter settled in his mind. She would learn, the hard way, as they all had. As they drove away, Elara did not watch them go. She turned back to her work, her focus absolute. Their skepticism was just another form of the wind, a force to be endured, not engaged with directly. Her faith was not in the saplings themselves, not in their present, fragile state. It was in the principle. It was a memory of Matthias, sitting by the fire during a storm 2 winters past, the cabin groaning under the assault. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke of the world he came from, a world of deep forests and ancient mountains, his language became precise, almost poetic. He had watched the wind tear at the solid wood of the barn, and he had shaken his head, not in fear, but in a kind of academic disagreement with its design. A solid wall is a challenge, he had told her, his voice a low rumble beneath the shrieking wind. He held his flat palm up against the firelight. The wind hits it, and it cannot pass. So it climbs, angry, and comes down twice as hard on the other side, stealing the heat from the roof. It carves out the ground behind the wall. It creates a vacuum. It is a fight. Then, he had interlaced the fingers of both hands, creating a porous screen. But this, he continued, blowing gently through the gaps, this does not challenge the wind. It does not try to stop it. It invites it in, and it breaks it into 1,000 smaller, weaker streams. It bleeds the strength from it. It persuades it to rest. That was the secret. That was the knowledge they lacked. Hiram saw a row of twigs. Elara saw a complex machine for calming the air. He saw a barrier that would fail. She saw a filter that would succeed. Her wall of trees was not intended to stop the snow. It was designed to rob the wind of the very energy it used to carry the snow. The blizzard would arrive as a raging, horizontal torrent, but as it passed through the increasingly dense rows of her windbreak, it would be forced to slow, to tumble, to surrender its momentum. And as it slowed, it would lose its grip on its payload. The snow, no longer held in furious suspension, would simply fall. It would drop from the air in a great, soft heap, not against her door, but deep within the embrace of the trees themselves. The windbreak would build its own wall, a massive, insulating berm of the very snow that would have otherwise buried her. She had tried to explain it once, in simpler terms, to Constance Hartwell, a quieter neighbor who watched Elara's labor with a curious, unjudging eye. "The trees will catch the snow before it gets to the house," Elara had said while they were both drawing water from the creek. Constance had considered this, her brow furrowed. "But the drifts will be immense, Elara. They will cover the trees entirely." Elara had nodded, shifting the weight of her buckets. "Yes, that is the point. The snow will become part of the wall." Constance had not scoffed. She had simply looked from Elara to the distant, hazy line of the mountains, a thoughtful expression on her face. She did not understand the principle, but she seemed to recognize the conviction behind it, and that, for Elara, was a small but welcome mercy. So the work continued, a long, grueling meditation through the heat of summer. The process was her entire world. It began each morning before the sun had baked the air with the rhythmic scrape of her spade against the hard, clay-ridden soil. She was not merely digging holes. She was creating a hospitable environment where one did not exist. For every sapling, she dug a pit 3 times wider than its root ball, loosening the compacted earth with a pickaxe until it was a crumbly, breathable medium. She knew the plains soil was poor, so she amended it. She hauled barrow after barrow of rich black earth from the creek bed, a place of dampness and decay and life. She mixed in the compost she had been painstakingly creating for a year, a dark, sweet-smelling concoction of kitchen scraps, chicken manure, and dried leaves that her neighbors saw as little more than a tidy garbage pile. Each sapling was chosen with a forester's eye, a skill learned from Matthias. She sought them not on the exposed hillsides, but in the crowded, competitive shelter of north-facing ravines. She looked for the ones that were already fighting, the ones with strong, straight leaders and dense branching, evidence of a resilient nature. She learned to read the story of the soil they grew in, and she wrapped their root balls in damp burlap for the long journey home in her wheelbarrow. The sensory details of the labor became her litany, the sharp, clean scent of pine resin that clung to her hands and clothes, the surprising weight of a waterlogged bucket, the cool slickness of the mud she used to form a basin around each tree to hold the precious water. She felt the grain of the spade's wooden handle, worn smooth by her own palms, and the ache in her shoulders that was no longer a stranger, but a constant companion. She spaced the trees with a meticulous geometry that baffled onlookers. The outer row, the one that would meet the wind first, was comprised of hardy spruce, their dense, low-sweeping branches designed to disrupt the airflow at ground level. They were planted closest together. The second and third rows were taller pines, staggered in a triangular pattern relative to the first row, ensuring there was no straight path for the wind to find. The entire configuration was a carefully engineered net, invisible in its purpose to anyone but her. It was a physical manifestation of Matthias's principle, and with every tree she planted, she felt she was not just preparing for winter, but honoring the quiet, profound wisdom he had left her. The work was slow, but her patience was boundless. She was not just building a wall, she was cultivating an ally. Autumn arrived, painting the distant cottonwoods along the creek in strokes of gold and rust. The wind began to carry a new edge, a sharp, cold premonition of the season to come. Elara's trees stood against it, their needles a deep and defiant green. They had survived the summer's heat, their roots taking hold in the soil she had prepared. They had grown, not much, but enough. She mulched their bases with a thick layer of straw, a final blanket against the encroaching cold. Her other preparations were conventional and complete. The woodpile was high and neatly stacked, the root cellar was full, and the cabin was chinked and sealed. But her gaze always returned to the crescent of young trees. They were the heart of her strategy, the physical embodiment of her faith in a less obvious truth. The first snows came in late October, light dustings that melted by noon. Then a heavier fall in November laid a white sheet across the prairie, and a quiet anxiety began to thread its way through the small community. This was the waiting period, the time of faith. Every homesteader knew the signs of a true blizzard. It was not the storm itself that was most terrifying, but the unnatural calm that preceded it. One afternoon in early December, that calm arrived. The ceaseless wind fell away to a dead stillness. The sky turned the color of lead, and the air grew so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. A profound and unnerving silence settled over the plains, broken only by the distant, lonely call of a crow. Elara brought her chickens into the small, sturdy coop, checked the latch on the barn door one last time, and went inside her cabin to wait. The storm did not arrive with a roar, but with a whisper. A few stray flakes drifted down, then a few more, and then the air thickened into a solid, swirling curtain of white. The wind came with it, rising from a moan to a piercing shriek in less than an hour. Elara stoked the fire in her small iron stove, her movements calm and deliberate. In past winters, a storm of this magnitude would have been a physical assault on the cabin. The walls would have shuddered, the windows would have rattled violently in their frames, and the wind would have found every tiny crack to scream through. But this time, something was different. The sound was altered. The roar of the gale was still present, a terrifying bass note on the edge of hearing, but the immediate, violent percussion against the cabin was gone. The sound was higher, more distant, as if the storm were happening to someone else, 100 yards away. For 2 days, the world beyond her windows ceased to exist. It was a churning vortex of white, a place of pure, elemental fury. Inside, there was a strange and profound peace. Her supply of firewood, which should have been dwindling at an alarming rate as she fought the cold, leached through the walls by the wind, was lasting longer. The small stove required less tending, its steady, radiant heat filling the single room with a comfortable warmth. This was the quiet tending of her system. The trees were doing their brutal work outside, unseen, and her role was simply to inhabit the sanctuary they created. She kneaded bread, mended a shirt, and read by the light of a kerosene lamp, trusting the process. She listened, not to the storm, but to the relative silence her little wall had won for her. She was not fighting the blizzard. She was living peacefully within its heart, protected by a principle of fluid dynamics that her neighbors had dismissed as folly. On the morning of the 3rd day, she awoke to a different kind of quiet. The deep, visceral silence of a world buried in snow. The wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a landscape transformed, sculpted into a new and alien geography. A pale, watery light filtered through the window. It was time. A familiar dread, a memory from winters past, tightened in her stomach. The front door, on the eastern side of the cabin, would be buried. She anticipated the grueling hours of work, tunneling out through a drift that could be 6 or 8 feet deep. Taking a deep breath, she pulled on her heavy coat and boots, picked up her shovel, and lifted the latch on the door. It swung inward with impossible ease. There was no wall of packed snow, no impenetrable drift. Before her, on the stone step, lay a smooth, undisturbed layer of soft powder, perhaps a foot deep. It was pristine, untouched. She stepped out, her boots sinking into it with a soft crunch. The air was bitingly cold, yet almost perfectly still. The world was a brilliant, blinding white under a newly cleared sky. She looked up and saw the sun, its light fracturing into a million diamonds on the surface of the snow. A sense of profound, quiet triumph washed over her, so potent it was almost dizzying. It was the sensory proof, the confirmation delivered not by argument, but by the irrefutable evidence of still air and a clear path. She walked around the side of the cabin, her breath pluming in the frigid air. And then she saw it. The result of her labor, the vindication of her principle. Her small, fragile trees were still standing, their green boughs laden with snow, but they were almost lost within the monumental structure they had created. Beginning about 50 feet from her cabin, where she had planted the first row, was a colossal drift. It was a solid, sculpted wave of snow, 15 feet high at its peak and hundreds of feet long, perfectly following the crescent shape of her windbreak. It was a fortress wall, built by the storm itself. The wind, carrying its load of snow, had entered the filter of trees, slowed, and simply deposited its burden. The snow that would have entombed her was now her outer defense, a massive, gleaming white berm that had absorbed the blizzard's fury. She walked to the edge of the drift and touched the feathery branches of a young spruce, its tip just visible above the snow. It was bowed, but not broken. She looked from the immense, captured drift back to the calm, protected space around her cabin. The contrast was absolute. Out on the open prairie, the wind was already beginning to stir again, lifting plumes of snow from the surface in ghostly tendrils. But here, in the lee of her living wall, there was only peace. Matthias's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if he were standing beside her. Work with the nature of a thing, not against it. She had not stopped the storm. She had simply shown it where to lay its burden down. It was a quiet, internal moment of connection, the successful outcome linking directly back to the foundational principle she had trusted. It was another day before she saw anyone. The entire territory was paralyzed, buried under drifts that blocked roads and buried outbuildings. Late in the afternoon, she saw a figure struggling towards her cabin from the direction of the Pool homestead. It was Hiram, wading through waist-deep snow, his face red from exertion and cold. He moved with the exhausted determination of a man who had been fighting a losing battle for days. He had likely spent a full day just clearing a path from his own door to his barn. As he drew closer, he stopped, leaning on his shovel to catch his breath. He stared, his mouth slightly agape. He was looking not at her, but at the clear space around her cabin, the easy path to her door, and the monumental, impossible drift held at bay by a line of what he had called switches. He trudged the last 100 feet and stopped before her, his bewilderment plain on his face. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of hard-won, practical knowledge, and everything he was seeing now contradicted it. Elara said nothing, simply waiting. She did not need to gloat. The landscape had done her arguing for her. "The drift," he began, his voice hoarse. "It's all here. It's not on your house." He looked at the trees, then back at the massive wall of snow they held. It dropped the snow. It just let go of it, right there. He was not asking a question, but stating a dawning, shocking realization. He was witnessing the principle in action. "That was the idea, Hiram," Elara said, her voice gentle. She gestured toward her door. "Come inside. I have coffee on the stove." He followed her numbly, stamping the snow from his boots on her step. Inside the warm cabin, she handed him a steaming mug. He took it, but he did not drink. He stood by her small window, looking out at the scene, running it over and over in his mind. He saw the gentle slope of snow leading away from her foundation, the utter lack of the characteristic scouring and piling that a blizzard always left behind a solid structure. He saw the calm. Finally, he turned from the window and looked at her, his eyes full of a new and profound respect. "I'll be," he said, the words a quiet admission of a world turned upside down. "All this time, Matthias." It was the only name he needed to say. It was an apology, an acknowledgement, and a question all in one. That spring, after the great melt, Hiram Poole came to her again. He was not alone. 2 other homesteaders, men of similar practical bent, came with him. They did not carry pity in their eyes, but notebooks and pencils. They did not offer to help her. They asked her to help them. "Elara," Hiram said, standing where he had once mocked her saplings, "would you show us how you chose them, how you spaced the rows?" She walked with them to the ravines, and she explained the difference between a tree that fought the wind and one that hid from it. She showed them how to read the soil. She drew diagrams in the dirt, explaining the staggered geometry, the layering of spruce and pine. She shared the knowledge Matthias had given her, passing it on not as a piece of folklore, but as a workable, life-saving science. They listened, they took notes, and they thanked her. In the years that followed, the Vance Wall became a feature of the High Plains. Homesteads that had once stood stark and exposed against the horizon began to shelter within the deep green crescents of growing trees. The saplings Elara had planted grew into a formidable, living barrier. Their roots gripping the soil, their branches filtering the relentless wind into a gentle breeze. Within their protective lee, gardens flourished, safe from the scouring winds that had once stripped the topsoil away. Livestock could shelter in the calm, saving their energy for survival rather than for fighting the cold. The groves became habitats, attracting birds and other life, creating small oases of tranquility in the harsh landscape. Elara Vance's quiet innovation, born of a husband's memory and her own unyielding faith in a principle, had done more than just protect a single cabin. It had fundamentally altered the terms of survival, teaching a generation of pioneers that the greatest strength was not in rigid resistance, but in the wise and patient art of yielding.